Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We'll give it just another minute or two for some more folks to arrive, and then we'll get started. Great. Well, I think we'll get going. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today as we launch new guidance from the Accountability Framework Initiative in partnership with the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, entitled Deforestation and Conversion-Free Supply Chains and Land Use Change Emissions, a guide to aligning corporate targets, accounting, and disclosure. I'm Leah Sandberg. I'm the lead scientist for global policy at the Rainforest Alliance and the Accountability Framework Initiative. As many of you know, both Sbti and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol introduced new guidance this month on how to set targets and account for greenhouse gas emissions from the land sector. Both organizations introduced their new guidance on webinars yesterday. So if you missed those, I'd invite you to watch the recordings for more detailed information. Next slide, please. The purpose of this new guidance that we'll be presenting today is to clarify how the suite of materials on accounting for and reducing emissions from land use change can be used together with guidance from the Accountability Framework Initiative on no deforestation and no conversion goals to support a holistic and aligned approach to addressing land use change in agriculture and forestry supply chains. It's intended to clarify how best practice on land use change emissions found in the new guidance from Sbti Flag and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol relates to best practice from the Accountability Framework on deforestation and conversion. There are three main components to this. The first is target setting. Companies are being asked to set both no deforestation and no conversion targets and science-based targets to reduce emissions from land use change. This document explains how those two types of targets relate to one another. The second is accounting. This guidance explains how accounting for deforestation and conversion and accounting for land use change emissions relate to one another at both the site level and the level of a sourcing area. The third is disclosure. What should companies be reporting to show progress towards both their no deforestation commitments and their flag emissions targets? And this guidance sets out some best practices and recommended indicators. In addition, as a primary resource for understanding land use change and commodity supply chains, the Accountability Framework provides a basis for aligned definitions and understanding of traceability, as well as good practice for supply chain commitments, all of which are embedded in Sbti Flag and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance, increasing consistency and clarity for companies. Next slide, please. We have a fantastic panel here today to talk about this new guidance. We'll hear from each of the organizations that helped to create it and then invite speakers from two leading companies to highlight some of the opportunities and challenges faced by their organizations in working to link forest, ecosystem, and climate goals. Our event is 90 minutes long today so that we're able to provide ample time for panelists to take your questions in the final half hour of our time together. A few quick notes before we start. This webinar is being recorded and a recording will be available on the AFI website next week. Please use the Q&A button to ask questions of our panelists, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Martha Stevenson is the Senior Director for Forest Strategy and Research at WWF and Senior Advisor to Sbti's Forest Land and Agriculture Project. Matt Ramlow is a research associate in the climate program at the World Resources Institute and one of the authors of the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance. Michelle Zollinger leads the Sustainable Sourcing Pulp and Paper Program and is the Climate Forest Lead at Nestle. Christoph Lebing is the Climate and Forests and Land Use Specialist at IKEA. And finally, we're really lucky to have a very knowledgeable moderator for this conversation. So I'll now hand this over to Louise Emerald, CEO of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Louise, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Leah, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. Really appreciate the invitation. It's so good to see some of those things coming together in such a well-structured, well-thought, and well-planned way. This week, we're witnessing milestones in the FLO sector with the Forest, Land, Agriculture, and Science-Based Target Setting Guidance by this Sbti, the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, and the new guidance for an AFI, Deforestation and Conversion-Free Supply Chains and Land Use Change Emissions. That is a perfect example of coordinated and bringing additional clarity, because that's the clarity that we all need when tackling all of our global environmental and development challenges, including climate emissions, deforestation, and land-related challenges. This guidance that AFI is releasing today provides an integrated approach for companies to link their no deforestation, no conversion commitments and policies with their efforts to reduce land sector emissions. By using those three pieces of guidance together, companies for the first time have comprehensive and aligned information on how to set targets, account for them, report on land use changes associated with agriculture and forest in their operations and supply chains. By addressing ecosystems and climate in an integrated way, we can begin to better leverage the mitigation potential of the sector, the mitigation potential that this sector has to prevent the devastating impacts of climate change and to enable a net zero future. I'm obviously biased because I've worked most of my life on the land and agricultural sector, from supporting investment into best farming practices with producers, to reducing deforestation supply chains, to promote restoration. So I know how this sector is very, very important to tackling our climate crisis with roughly 1/4 of global emissions, but also how it's intrinsic within its operations to be also a solution for climate change, given that all of its operations are nature-based, but are also at the biggest risk of climate change, because changes in climate patterns really affects agriculture as a whole. What we're trying to do today is a clear example of when 1 + 1 + 1 equals much more than 3. I'm looking forward to hearing from the expert panel today about the contents of this guidance and how it can be used by companies. So without further ado, to get us started, I'll turn a question to Martha, which was the lead within the Sbti guidance work. Companies are increasingly expecting to have both targets for eliminating commodity-driven deforestation and ecosystem conversion, and on top of that, science-based targets to reduce land sector emissions. How are all of those things and all of those sets of expectations related, Martha?
Great, thanks, Louise. So the short story is that these are all very intimately connected. So just to do a little history on kind of the deforestation space first, some production standards started requiring zero deforestation as early as 1993, like the Forest Stewardship Council standard, and then others followed suit early in the 2000s. We saw a dramatic increase in companies making deforestation commitments in 2010. And while some progress has been achieved, I think we can all agree that there's still a lot of work to do to achieve these commitments. And as these commitments, as we started focusing on deforestation, we witnessed the unintended impacts of focusing on deforestation, pushing this land use change into other ecosystems. So the NGO community has sounded the alarm for no conversion of any ecosystem commitments, in addition to deforestation. And this is supported directly by the draft Convention on Biological Diversity framework, where we want to stop nature loss with a cutoff year of 2020. And it's indirectly supported by the UNFCCC pursuit of 1.5 degree futures. So as you mentioned, yesterday we launched the Sbti Forest, Land, and Agriculture Target Setting Guidance, or Sbti FLAG as we call it. And this solidifies the connection between greenhouse gas emissions from land use change and zero deforestation and conversion commitments. As you can see on the slide here, the AFLU sector, or agriculture, forestry, and other land use, contributes 22% of global emissions annually. And these are emissions that have not been included in corporate inventories for the most part to date. Next slide, please. So within this AFLU or FLAG sector, the types of activities that contribute these emissions, we break down into two categories. First, land use change. Second, land management. So when we're talking about land use change, sorry, go back. We're talking about specific actions like deforestation, forest degradation, and then conversion of all ecosystems, shrublands, grasslands, wetlands, and also burning peat. So that's all included in land use change emissions. In the second category for land management emissions, we're looking at everything that's happening on farm or in forest. These include livestock management like enteric emissions or manure. It includes fertilizer application, and then of course, various soils, pasture, and forest management practices. We also have a secret weapon in this sector, as Louise alluded to, where we can provide carbon removals as part of our climate action pursuits as well. This includes activities like integrating tree systems into pasture through silvopasture, improving forest management to increase sequestration, and also implementing agroforestry and enhancing soil carbon practices like the additions of biochar. Next slide. And when we look at all these opportunities, we see very clearly that land use change is one of the most important to get right and get right very quickly, as it represents half of this sector's contribution, which is 11% of global emissions every year. Next slide. So I want to dig in a little bit to the science. I'll walk you through the slide. This is a graph from the IPCC's special report on 1.5. And the big black line that you see here, that is net CO2 emissions for the world, for the globe. And this is one of the sets of pathways that we call SSP2, or its middle of the road pathways, on our pursuit of 1.5. Now, I'll invite you to look at the red circle in the middle of the screen. That is our net zero moment for CO2 emissions, where the black line crosses the dotted line, or zero. So this is where CO2 emissions are neutralized by CO2 sequestration below the dotted line. And as you can see, we're estimating that this event happens again for the world around 2050 or soon thereafter. Now, the brown wedge across the bottom, that represents CO2 emissions from the agriculture and forestry sector. And if you look at where the red line is, we can see that those emissions, in order to enable these pathways to 1.5, those emissions are the first to cross that line, and we need them to happen relatively quickly. So that red line is, maybe 2025 or soon thereafter. So we know this is really important. We know that emissions and land use change of all kinds are intimately connected and really needed to keep 1.5 degrees on the table. So we like to say that there's no net zero without zero land use change. Next slide. So back to FLAG. So this is why we've focused so much on this issue within the FLAG commitment. So as of yesterday, moving forward, and there's kind of a rolling time cycle of when this will impact various companies across the FLAG sector. But over the next couple of years, companies will be required to include these forest, land, and agriculture emissions and removals within their Sbti target. So it's in addition to their traditional Sbti target that focuses on energy and industry. Next slide, please. And in addition to this emissions target, because action on deforestation and no conversion is so critical, we have made the additional request that as companies are submitting their target to Sbti for validation, that they are required to submit a no deforestation commitment with a target date of no later than 2025. And we are also recommending that companies align with the Accountability Framework Initiative guidance, including a 2020 cutoff date, a no conversion commitment, and also no peat burning. This is why I'm so excited about the document that we are launching today, because it serves as a Rosetta Stone, so to speak, for these two issues in a really important way. We know it's confusing, the accounting rules are different, and we'll talk about this a little bit more today, but both are vitally important and super important tools for us to use as we manage toward 1.5 degree futures with a nature positive future. So thanks, Louise.
Well, thank you very much, Martha, for this great explanation. And every time I hear you speak, it feels like I get a little bit smarter. with the great explanations and scientific basis. So moving on to Matt. Matt, I'm a firm believer that what does not get measured does not get managed, right? And the work that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has been doing for the past 20 years is absolutely paramount for all of the discussions that we're having here. We probably would not be here if we hadn't started, if JG Protocol has not started its journey about 20 years ago. So the question that we have for you is, the JG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance provides a great deal of detail on how companies should quantify their emissions from land use change. Can companies use the same processes and systems to account for deforestation and conversion in their supply chains and LUC emissions?
Thanks, Luis. That's a great question. And I know this has been a focus as both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team, along with Sbti Flag and AFI, have been developing these guidance together. We know that companies are being asked to account for a lot of these various metrics within this space, and we know that it's important for us to achieve these zero deforestation and conversion commitments, as well as our climate targets. So when we were working on our individual frameworks and guidance, we had this in mind of how do we build on what we've learned from existing approaches, but more importantly, how can we streamline that so that companies can build MRV systems that use very similar types of data and collection points, recognizing the different metrics that need to be reported on. So with that, I can go ahead and kind of walk us through a little bit about how we've designed this document to clarify how we've aligned on key areas such as definitions, the way we think about traceability within supply chains, and then some of the nuances between reporting on deforestation and conversion versus greenhouse gas emissions. So first of all, one of the key areas is aligning on definitions. In this process, we have aligned our guidance and definitions around definitions developed by the accountability framework over the years through partnerships with some of the core members of AFI. So here you can see deforestation, as Martha and Leah were referring to earlier, is defined as the loss of natural forest as a result of conversion to agriculture or other non-forest land use. It can also include conversion to a tree plantation or severe or sustained degradation. And again, the loss of natural forest that meets this definition is considered to be deforestation regardless of whether or not it's legal. Alternatively, we have the broader definition of conversion, which is looking at changes of any natural ecosystem from one land use or a profound change in natural ecosystem species composition, structure, or function. So you can really think of deforestation as one form of conversion, but conversion would include other types of land use change, such as conversion of native grasslands to croplands or intensively managed rangelands. Again, for conversion, it's considered this whether or not that this is illegal. Likewise, another term that you'll see in a lot of the guidance document is land use change. This is drawing from some of the publications of the IPCC, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol also draws on IPCC land use categories, which again are aligned with these definitions. So land use change is just conversion from one land use category of forests, grasslands, croplands, wetlands, settlements, or other lands to another. So that could be forest to cropland conversion, which would be considered deforestation. Next slide, please. So one of the areas where there is some slight differences between the two frameworks, and again, this is building on precedent within the space as these two different areas have evolved over time, is on the time considerations. So deforestation and conversion-free supply chains are assessed relative to a cutoff date. So the key thing to note here is that this is a fixed date after which deforestation or conversion on a given site renders the materials produced on that site non-compliant with the policy. So there's been a lot of work within various geographies and subsectors to set cutoff dates. So we have some examples like the Amazon soy moratorium, and companies are encouraged to adopt those existing cutoff dates that are already out there. If companies do not already have a cutoff date, they should set a date that's no later than 2020 And ideally, AFI recommends selecting one that is within the last 5 years prior to the reporting year. Land use change emissions are counted a little bit differently. It's relative to an assessment period. And this is a time period that's used to evaluate whether or not land use change occurs. So for most annual crops and other short rotation crops, this would be a 20-year period prior to the year of reportings. For crops with longer rotation periods, such as forestry or certain tree crops, this may be greater than 20 years, and then that longer period would be used. And this is building on precedent within IPCC of the time that it takes for carbon stocks to reach a new equilibrium, and it also recognizes diverse land use trajectories. And we'll see how these are implemented a little bit differently as we go through. Great. So now thinking about traceability, this is one where we really tried to align the framework so that companies building out their MRV systems would be able to use similar approaches. You can see here there's 3 different scenarios. The first one where maybe companies only have limited or no traceability to a country of origin. In these cases, companies are encouraged to report on the volume of materials sourced by country or unknown origin. Because it's difficult to really determine whether or not there are deforestation or conversion-free volumes given that limited traceability. For land use change emission accounting, we could use national or global, what we call statistical land use change emissions. So these are typically found within databases where they've done these analyses to analyze how much land use change is occurring within at a country level or globally that companies could look up and use. To really get into understanding your supply chain, though, companies are encouraged to increase traceability. So many times you may have traceability to a sourcing area, which could be a sourcing radius from a first point of collection or a subnational jurisdiction. And when companies have this level of traceability for deforestation conversion-free accounting, they would report on the hectares of natural ecosystem conversion in that sourcing area attributable to the company's sourcing. Similarly, companies can use statistical land use change emissions within that sourcing area, also attributable to the amount of goods that the company is purchasing from that area. Finally, the greatest degree of traceability companies would have would be to the individual production unit. So this would be the farm or the forest management unit or the plantation that the company is sourcing from. In these cases, the companies would also need to report on the hectares of natural ecosystem conversion on known production units. And this could be in a company's own operations or in their supply chain where they have that traceability. Similarly, Greenhouse Gas Protocol describes the metric of direct land use change within those production units. So moving on to the next slide, we'll explain a little bit of the stepwise process that companies would go through to do this assessment, both on the D-free or the land use change side. So I think the first area, as I was alluding to, is to just identify if you have known production units and that traceability that's needed back to those. And this would be the same for both deforestation-free and land use change emissions. On the D-free side, the next step would be to detect any land use change that is occurring within that production unit since the cutoff date. Again, just to note the difference here that for land use change emission, this land use change would be detected during that 20-year assessment period instead. And then finally, after companies detect any land use change after the cutoff date, they would then calculate the total hectares of conversion within those production units and report on that. For land use change, there's a number of additional steps because we layer in carbon stocks and other greenhouse gas emissions to the area experiencing land use change. Since it's a 20-year assessment period, we also have guidance on how you would amortize that over the assessment period over time using either linear or equal discounting. And then if it's a production unit producing multiple units, you would allocate land use change emissions to products using physical, economic, or area time allocation. All of this is described in detail in the draft that we recently released that's publicly available on our website right now. Again, this is a draft version of our Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance, and we anticipate publication in Q2 of 2023. Finally, for land use change emissions, if this is in a company's own operations, they would report this as Scope 1 land use change emissions for all land use change occurring in the production unit. or for scope 3, they would multiply these direct land use change emission factors by to the volume that they source from that production unit. Moving on to the next slide. So we'll see that at a sourcing region, you do follow a lot of the same steps. So I maybe don't need to go through all of them here, but just to kind of highlight some of the key differences is in the sourcing region assessment, you have a broader area that you're assessing deforestation over. So it's likely going to pick up on potentially more land use change that's occurring within that sourcing region. If you look down to step 3 for deforestation conversion-free supply chains, in this step, you would then allocate that any natural ecosystem conversion to products that are produced within that sourcing region. And you can do that by 2 different methods. One would be based on the land area that's occupied by each of those products, so the land area under production for each of them, or the relative product expansion. So how much land is expanding within that region in terms of producing different types of products. This is the same approach that Greenhouse Gas Protocol has adopted for our what we call statistical land use change assessment, where we refer to these as the shared responsibility, which is based on the land area occupied, or the product expansion approach. So we're really trying to use that same allocation method to take that sourcing region and divide that up across the different products that are produced within there. And then finally, at a sourcing region level, companies would report on the total hectares of ecosystem conversion attributable to the volume that they're sourcing from that region, or likewise, you would multiply a statistical land use change emission factor to the volume that you're sourcing from the sourcing area. So hopefully that clarifies the kind of stepwise process for accounting for these 2 metrics, but you can see that there's a lot of similar data that's used for both of them. The last point that I wanted to make before handing it over would be just to clarify that while land use change is important, and I think Martha alluded to this within her slides, it's not the full picture. So this is a pie chart that's looking at not globally, but global food systems. What is the breakdown of the different greenhouse gas emission by different life cycle stages? So you can see within food systems, land use change contributes roughly 1/3 of the total emissions. If you advance, and you can see that this is accounted for in our Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance under land use change. If you can advance the slide, I have some animations here, thanks. If we keep going, you can see the next broad category that we define and we provide guidance on in Greenhouse Gas Protocol is what we call land management non-CO2 emissions. So this is emissions from enteric fermentation, from fertilizer use, and also on-site energy. And you can see this makes up roughly another 1/3 of the picture when it comes to global food system emissions. Finally, if you look at the other stages of the food system value chain of transport, processing, packaging, retail, consumption, and end of life, such as waste, this makes up 28% or roughly another 1/3. So this is just to highlight the fact that companies that are setting flag targets, while land use change is a critical component of this, there's also work that needs to be done on some of these other emissions as well that contribute to their targets. Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides additional guidance on how companies would account for removals. And we also have another category we call the land tracking metrics that are looking at the impacts on the global demand for land use. So with that, I can go ahead and hand it back to Luis.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for all those very clear presentation and clarifications. As I mentioned, I think it's tremendously important, the work that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol does. And if we hadn't started 20 years ago, we would not be here, because you need to measure in order to manage. So moving on, so we discussed a little bit about the alignment on target setting with Martha, accounting for LUC with Matt. So now accounting on disclosure and progress on DCF goals. A question to Leah. While many companies have made commitments to eliminate deforestation ecosystem conversion from their supply chains, disclosure of progress has been limited and sometimes inconsistent. What new information does this guidance provide from the Accountability Framework Initiative to clarify for companies how to account for and report progress against their no deforestation and no conversion goals.
Thanks, Luis. And thanks to Matt and Martha for those summaries of how your organization's new guidance supports companies in accounting for and reducing land use change emissions. We know that elimination of commodity-driven deforestation and ecosystem conversion is essential for meeting corporate and global climate goals, and this new suite of guidance makes that connection really immediately clear. So in addition to linking corporate actions to reduce land sector emissions to actions by those same companies to eliminate deforestation and ecosystem conversion, another primary goal of this guidance is to provide greater detail on recommended good practice for accounting and disclosure related to no deforestation and no conversion goals themselves. So I'm going to provide an overview of 4 topics in this guidance that provide new and more detailed information for companies. For each of these topics, the new guidance summarizes existing information from the accountability framework, provides further details on methods, and recommends robust indicators for disclosure via corporate reporting through aligned platforms such as CEP Forests. So the 4 topics I'm going to touch on briefly are deforestation and conversion at the level of the production unit, and deforestation and conversion at the level of a sourcing area, as Matt laid out in his presentation, accounting and disclosure around products for which deforestation and conversion impacts are not known, and then a reporting or accounting and disclosure around deforestation and conversion-free or DCF performance and progress. The next slide, please. So first, accounting for the hectares of deforestation and conversion that have occurred since the cutoff date at the level of production units owned or managed by the company or known to be in its supply chain provides the most information about the impact of company activities, about their operations, about their sourcing. So assessing deforestation and conversion at this level is generally preferred when possible. It requires known and mapped locations of a given production unit, most often a polygon. Land use change can be monitored directly. It can be gathered from suppliers who are able to pass that information on to their buyers, or it can be obtained using third-party certification schemes with chain of custody models that provide traceability to origin. So of note in this guidance is some new detail from the AFI on how to sort of perform these calculations. We provide guidance, we provide the recommendation that when assessing land use change at this scale, all post-cutoff date conversion in the production unit should be included, regardless of the current use of that land. Accounting in this way ensures that emissions accounting accurately reflects the actions of the producer. It accounts for management practices such as crop rotation or fallows, as well as accounts for progressive conversion trajectories, for example, from pasture to soy or from forest management to a plantation. So we recommend that companies look at a whole production unit when accounting for deforestation and conversion at this scale. Next slide, please. Next, we provide more detail on when and how deforestation or conversion should be estimated at the level of a sourcing area, which can range from the source shed of a primary processing facility or small farms in a co-op or production landscape up to a subnational jurisdiction. Accounting for and reporting on hectares of deforestation and conversion associated with agricultural and forest commodities at the scale of a sourcing area might be appropriate in a couple of different instances. For example, when downstream companies don't yet have physical traceability to the production unit, they may need to set as this level while they improve their traceability. It might also be appropriate where that sourcing area is the most relevant scale for managing deforestation and conversion risk, or when companies source from jurisdictions or landscapes where it can be shown that there's been no or negligible recent conversion. So this guidance adds detail to existing recommendations in the accountability framework, indicating that companies should use allocation methods that account for all land use change associated with agriculture or forestry in that sourcing area in line with the GHG protocol. And noting that allocation approaches based on project-specific conversion, so looking at land use change that's only specifically under one product of interest might not effectively account for land use change trajectories in a sourcing area, and therefore may not be credible without additional monitoring or assurance. Next slide, please. So third, this document clarifies the AFI's expectations for transparency regarding volumes for which traceability is limited and deforestation or conversion impact are unknown. So this includes volumes that are traceable to the level of a country as well as volumes that are with completely unknown origin. Reporting these volumes provides essential context for understanding reporting on sourcing for which origin is known. So we'd like to make it clear that companies should be reporting on 100% of their sourcing or their production, regardless of whether deforestation and conversion is assessed or not, to provide appropriate and comprehensive context. Next slide, please. In addition to measuring and reporting on their deforestation and conversion footprint, companies are encouraged to assess and report the proportion of volumes in their supply chains or operations that can be considered deforestation and conversion free, or DCF. Deforestation and conversion free signifies that materials did not originate on production units on which conversion from forests or other natural ecosystems has occurred after a specified cutoff date. This guidance provides new and more detailed information on the approaches that could be used to calculate DCF volumes via direct monitoring, via monitoring at the level of a sourcing area, or using certification systems. It also provides recommendations on key aspects of the methodology that may greatly affect the reported DCF percentage. So these are the inclusion of all origins, regardless of the risk level or other consideration, the use of a clear and consistent cutoff date, the assessment of land use change at the level of the production unit, as was mentioned previously, and the consideration of all land use change in a sourcing area when considering whether or not something can be assessed to be deforestation and conversion free. Next slide, please. We also provide recommendations in this new guidance on indicators for reporting on DCF volumes, indicating that the percentage of total production or sourcing that's DCF should be reported, as well as a breakdown of the different approaches taken to that DCF assessment, such as direct monitoring or certification. So companies can say, we are sourcing 80% of our volumes deforestation and conversion free, 50% of that occurs through certified material, 30% of that is assessed through direct monitoring of production units, for example. Next slide, please. And finally, it's important to recognize that many companies are not going to reach 100% DCF sourcing overnight. This is an iterative process, and therefore reporting on DCF sourcing should therefore be accompanied by reporting on actions being taken to address those non-DCF origins and suppliers. This progress is already reported in many ways, and this guidance includes suggestions for indicators that companies should consider when disclosing progress for these portions of their supply chain. And these include activities related to supplier engagement, to management of non-compliant suppliers, to participation in landscape or jurisdictional initiatives in high-risk sourcing areas, and processes to increase traceability for volumes which are not yet traceable to origin. And one more slide. So one final point that I'd like to touch on is that the Accountability Framework Initiative Coalition is working collaboratively to ensure that companies can continue to use existing reporting and disclosure platforms to communicate all of this information. So all of the recommendations on accounting related to deforestation and conversion can be reported using the CDP Forest Questionnaire, can be reported using the Global Reporting Initiative's new Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fishing Sector Standard, and assessed through other existing platforms. For example, new indicators on deforestation and conversion and DCF volumes have been added to these methodologies over the past year. There's an example here of a question in this year's CDP Forest Questionnaire, looking at assessing, asking whether a company has monitored and assessed deforestation footprint of their products. And we have similar questions added into the new GRI standard. So that's a really quick overview of the work we're doing to provide as much detailed guidance as we can to support consistent and standardized accounting and reporting related to no deforestation and no conversion commitments. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leah, for presenting that. So we've heard a little bit about the science and goal setting, right? Then we heard a little bit about the accounting piece, and a little bit of now with Leah about the accountability piece. But I've worked most of my life on the private sector. It has been about 5 years or so that I've been working on the not-for-profit, and I learned the jargon as well. So we discussed all about the enablers, are the things that are supporting and facilitating action, but not the action itself, which we all need. So to move into that discussion now, I would like to call into Michelle, and ask you a question. How is Nestle integrating its work on deforestation with newer goals for emission reductions? How is all of this new guidance from AFI, Sbti, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol together useful for you in this process?
Yeah, thanks so much, Louise. And thanks also for the invitation to join this conversation today. Maybe very quickly, first off, a big congratulations to Martha, Matt, and Leah for getting these different guidances launched. I know how much work went into that, so it's really great to see. So during my time today, I want to address your question, Louise, kind of mentioning three elements of this. First, just give a quick background about the journey of Nestle and how we've worked on deforestation and how that got integrated into our newer climate goals. Then comment briefly on, from an ag and food sector perspective, what is the critical role that these type of new guidances actually play, and then share some additional thoughts and reflections to end. So first off, Nestle's journey started in 2010 when the company made a deforestation-free commitment focused on the key commodities, so palm, soy, sugar, pulp and paper, and beef, to set targets which were achieving no deforestation-free targets by 2022 for those commodities, and then by 2025 for coffee and cocoa. And this is very much, was and still is very much built into kind of the responsible sourcing activities and commitments that have been happening since then as well. In 2019, Nestle then set the commitment to be net zero by 2050 and to halve the corporate emissions by 2030. So what that meant is that we had to set targets for 2025, 2030, and 2050 that are all aligned with Sbti requirements. As you know, a big food and ag company, the biggest impact is going to come from our ingredients. So if you can shift to the next slide, just want to pull this up briefly. This will be my only slide today, but just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of exactly what Matt and Martha were already talking about. So our scope 3 really represents about 95 of our total footprint, corporate footprint. And you can see in the upper left, right corner, how much sourcing of our ingredients, 71% in this case, contributes to this footprint. So it's a really large scope that is key for us to consider. And really most of this, what is contributing to the 71%, is driven by deforestation or land use change. So it's not surprising then when we think about our net zero roadmap, how much investing and kind of implementing regenerative agricultural practice, stopping deforestation, investing in agroforestry and silviculture projects, and conserving and restoring forests and peatlands are part of the actions that we committed to. On top of this, you can stop sharing the screen now. Thank you so much. On top of this, we've also last year launched our Forest Positive strategy, which was really born out of this, these learnings of over 10 years working on no deforestation-free commitments. And that whole work over the past years have taught us how conserving forests in the long term, it's actually not enough to only invest in our direct land and direct supply chain. We also need to address the sustainability of landscapes, the sourcing landscapes that those supply chains are actually part of. So it includes thinking about what are the other actors, what are the dynamics, and what are the kind of specifics and interactions in that landscapes that happen. I'm highlighting this because it really created a mindset shift, which is that the private sector and especially food and ag companies need to collectively move to managing risk, from managing risk to generally focusing on how can we achieve a positive impact in critical landscapes that really underpin the food system. To be able to do that, we need to be honest about the complexity that this takes and the changes ahead. We also need to recognize that forest conversion and restoration is is about much more than just keeping trees standing and natural ecosystems intact. It's really about reshaping the incentives and how people are at scale able to protect the forest in the long run. So to help kind of with that background, to help indicate where these type of guidances fit, there are mainly two areas that I want to highlight here. The first one is really how these type of guidances that the previous panelists were talking about allow companies to measure consistently and also align on how they have to do that across the board. As mentioned, Nestle launched the net zero journey in 2019, and that was in a context where these guidances didn't exist yet. So you can imagine there's a lot of uncertainty to navigate. What can count, what will count, how do we plan for all of these different scenarios? We already took action because we believe we need to act now, so we did that. But we have seen that this has been and can continue to be a key barrier for other companies, a key barrier for investment and collaboration when there's kind of a lack of accounting definitions. And so that's also why in most cases we haven't seen a lot of kind of a lot of companies implementing NCS at the speed that we actually need to do. So I'm very excited to see this launched, very welcomed also by the industry to have these documents available, because it does allow companies to more consistently measure and take action that is very much needed. The second element why these guidances are key is they really serve to create the enabling environment to incentivize ag and food companies to urgently undertake the required transformative action within their supply chain. So Martha has alluded to that in her section, but also in the, you can see it in the urgency of the IPCC report. The agricultural sector has a pretty critical role to play in this whole picture. Key priorities that the sector needs to work on are halting commodity-driven destruction, so deforestation or land use change, support. The second priority would be supporting farmers on, especially small farm holders, on being able to transition to regenerative production practices. And the third one is to figure out how we can restore historically degraded areas caused by agricultural commodities. These challenges need to be addressed at scale, urgently, and collaboratively. Land sector companies are actually uniquely suited to drive these type of projects because they're usually already invested in these type of ecosystems. They are sourcing from those landscapes, and they have an vested interest to make sure these landscapes and communities are resilient, are productive. It's also more likely that these companies actually invest in safeguards, social safeguards, to support healthy and inclusive livelihoods and economies. And ultimately, the permanence of these type of projects, natural climate solution or nature-based projects, really also allow for collaboration. So it will require joint work between the farmers, the suppliers, the traders, and the buyers themselves to really transform the nature of how agricultural value chains look like today. So to us, and to really maximize Nestle's impact, and the impact of other businesses in the land sector, these type of rules and regulations really need to be crafted to incentivize companies to invest directly within their supply chain and their sourcing landscapes. I don't want to say everything is solved yet, because as Matt was mentioned, there are definitely still some areas of work, and this is what is being explored now with this draft guidance out in the next phase, which is the piloting phase. So it's going to be really critical to ensure, these rules have to set up the right incentives for companies, but we also need to recognize the reality of complex supply chains. And to do that, we need to ensure that guidances and rules are pragmatic while also being solid and credible. So I just want to highlight three specific examples that I know we'll definitely look into for our piloting, but just to give you kind of a clarity on what I mean here. The first example is about actions needed in our supply chains and how they require deep engagement. If we really want to achieve this 1.5 degrees, they require deep engagement with different suppliers, different industry peers, and we will need to collectively find ways to invest and support this industry transformation. So the question is, how can we do that? What are different market mechanisms that are already out there that can be integrated into accounting as tools? And how can we ensure that these accounting rules also allow for this type of collaboration? The second example I want to mention is regarding how do we really address kind of negative impacts. To be able to do that in our supply chains, we also need to think about restorative action in our sourcing or the landscape surrounding farms and not just on the farms themselves. This is a common practice when we think about water. You have to take action also in the water catchment area. It's a very common practice for biodiversity. How do you kind of think about farms and surrounding natural landscapes for biodiversity topics? It's the same for the climate case. And then the third example I want to mention is there's a lot of discussion around managing permanence and emission reversals. So how do we really set up the right monitoring system for that? And this is one of the areas to kind of build on and still explore more. But I think the key piece there is just to make sure that we find a way that the rules allow to really focus action on impact on the ground, and not that everything becomes an accounting exercise and all the money from companies goes into the counting instead of the impact on the ground. So I want to leave you with a key message, just a call for action. I really highly encourage any companies listening in, especially in the food and ag space, to participate in this piloting. We believe this is the moment to inform and provide also important feedback to the team, to Matt and the team working on these different guidance elements, and also allow companies, to inform how this guidance needs to be set up, so the companies that are asked to do this work can really drive the transformation at the scale that is needed. Thanks. I'll pass it back on to you, Lise.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this overview of the work in one company working into the sector. So continue on that same side of the equation, I'd like to move to Christoph and ask more or less the same question from a different perspective of another company that is working within the sector. What tools and systems does IKEA use to source deforestation-free wood products, and how are those being used or adapt to address emissions targets as well? How is all of this new guidance from AFI, Sbti, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol useful within this process?
Thanks a lot, Luis. And thanks a lot for a great question. I think in general, I would also just like to give congrats really for this milestone achievement. This month is really quite exciting with the launch of the three very important, very interconnected guidances. And I would like to talk just some 10 minutes about the tools, the ways how IKEA was approaching this topic in the past and is planning to approach this topic in the future, how to ensure zero deforestation, and with the focus somewhat on wood products in our case. Next slide, please. So how do we aim to assure, in general, responsible sourcing across our value chain of our raw materials and ingredients? And I think important to notice in the beginning that securing these responsible sourcing practices of raw materials is not anymore only an ambition for IKEA, but it really is a business critical obligation and is essential to ensure sustainable supply in the future. That is then also meeting all the legal requirements that are coming up very fast, especially in the European Union that we are seeing. And I would like to highlight one term that IKEA is basically coining, which is the I way, which means it's the IKEA way of responsibly procuring products, services, materials, and components. And this basically means if you want to be an IKEA supplier, then you do have to fulfill certain requirements. And these requirements, of course, do also cover other aspects, like, for example, worker safety, child labor, social aspects, environmental aspects, but also then commitments towards zero deforestation, for example. And I think for one click, there's then one effect on the slide, where you see on this lower part, there needs to be a common solution to enable this traceability for transparent supply chains, due diligence systems, to ensure compliance across the whole supply chain. And this is not something that IKEA right now already has, but this is very much under development. And there's a lot of focus on this right now to assure this across all our raw materials. With wood, the journey is somehow more evolved for IKEA. But as we will see on the next slide, please, we have to know where our wood is first of all coming from in order to secure deforestation-free wood products. And if you click, you will see that we have a quite diverse location where we do source our wood. And also if you look at this volume and the bold number below, with these some 15, 16 million cubic meters of round wood equivalent, IKEA is actually one of the largest industrial wood consumers in the world. But we do have most of our supplies in Europe, where you see that Poland is the most important supply country. But also there are some countries in there which we will see that have potential some deforestation risk. So how do we cover then that when we source wood from these regions, that they are deforestation free? Next slide, please. And what we coined there as a term is a more sustainable sources. And some 10 years ago, there was basically a visionary decision taken within IKEA that we will have 100% sustainable sources by 2020, which we basically achieved. I think this was a great, really landmark achievement. We were not sure back then, some 10 years ago, when this decision was taken to move to 100% MSS, but we did it in the end, and we started from a quite low baseline, as you can see in this journey over the past years. And what does MSS actually mean? It is quite concrete for wood. It means it's either FSC certified or it's post-consumer recycled wood. Next slide, please. So in general, of course, traceability and compliance monitoring is an integral part if you want to safeguard zero deforestation commitments. And I would say there's not like this one advice that we now as IKEA could give to say, this is a silver bullet, this is how you will achieve it. But there are, I think, 3 common aspects that will have to be in place in order to ensure zero deforestation commitments. One is that you will have to have clear requirements for all your suppliers that want to enter your supply chain and a clear supplier code of conduct. Within the way for IKEA, it's called iWay, and there's a special iWay forestry section, which is now in the new version of 6.0, just now being rolled out. But then there needs to be a third-party audited certification scheme that does align with your vision and with your values. And there we did commit quite early and quite strongly with FSC as our one certification scheme that we use across all our wood supply to assure that they do meet our requirements and standards. And last but not least, that is also, I think, quite some specific strengths of IKEA, that we do have ability to verify this compliance all over the world with a dedicated wood supply and forestry team with specialists that sit everywhere close to where we source raw materials, that do work very actively with our suppliers, explaining them changes in the standard, explain them the requirements, and work together with them also how to assure compliance with these requirements, how to develop sustainable sourcing practices, and also efficient sourcing practices that are related to sustainable forest management. So in general, how does this then connect with the land use change commitment and greenhouse gas emissions? In general, what we do count on basically is that our FSC certified wood can be counted as zero deforestation because it has a very high alignment with the definition how AFI is now proposing to interpret deforestation. So that would then allow us to, by having FSC certified wood, to claim zero deforestation and also to claim no emissions stemming from direct or statistical land use change. But there are some very critical, practical aspects, I think, to consider. One is around the controlled wood aspect of FSC. FSC is a mixed credit claim. Of course, there's FSC 100% also, but in the very rare cases, only this is the case. In the vast majority of cases, FSC wood is a mixed credit system. And it has its minimum requirements also on controlled wood. But how good have to be this minimum requirements be audited? What kind of quality of safeguards is enough in terms of assurances around these controlled wood? I think there needs to be a quite good discussions among the different stakeholders involved, including AFI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and Sbti, and of course the certification bodies. How can this controlled wood aspect be used to make claims around, for example, zero deforestation? And I think one very important aspect that we would like to explore together with now the new guidance authors and also with other companies using these new guidances is to clearly distinguish between tree cover loss and deforestation. Because tree cover loss can stem from different actions on the ground, and very often it is part of also sustainable forest management practices, where you do have limited clear-cut areas that can be then picked up by algorithms, like for example from Global Forest Watch, and be detected as it is labeled tree cover loss, but can enter these emission factors as actually land use change emissions. So I think there needs to be very clear understanding between distinguishing what is forest management and what is really permanent land cover change. And in conclusion, I would really like to highlight that AFI is bringing very much improved nuance to the table, where we are now able to distinguish natural forests from forest plantations. This is something that the FAO definition of land use change did not provide for. And I think there's clear examples where a primary forest being converted into a forest plantation is losing a lot of its environmental service potential, also including carbon, that can be easily compared to a land cover change from forest into pasture. So I think it is really good to have this, ability to distinguish in place. It also comes very timely and relevant because, as I was mentioning in the beginning, there are very much upcoming legislation on the horizon that are demanding from companies much better reporting, much better traceability systems, and ability to comply with these kind of guidances that will be then also legally required. So it's really well connecting, I think, that these guidances are coming out now. We look very much forward in general to this pilot session now. We're very involved also in development of the standards as technical working group members, but I think we'll gain a lot of useful knowledge now from these case studies, and especially around these edge cases, how they have been defined in the AFI deforestation guidance also, where we will really see on concrete examples how to make this operational. Of course, I think, as was already highlighted, it's not ideal that the time horizon, how land use change is defined under emission accounting and under zero deforestation commitment, is now different. This can lead to different communication, I think, around target fulfillment, where we do have then potentially zero deforestation commitment achieved, but still have land use change emissions in our reporting. We know where this comes from, but I think that would be great if there could be some alignment still between these time horizon considerations. But in general, we really look forward now to continue this exploration and working with all of you together to put these guidances into practice. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so very much, Christoph. So we saw, and we went through a journey here today, right? We saw about the science and the target setting guidance. Then we discussed a little bit about the accounting piece, then the accountability piece, and then we went into real practitioners that explain a little bit the strategies and how all that fits together. And I would like to thank you a lot, the speakers, for those insights and bringing all those things together. It's clear that those new guidances can help support companies in achieving some of the most important milestones in accounting and reducing land use, accounting for reducing land use change from agriculture and forest, the bad type of land use change at least. The AFOLU sector is one of the most affected by the impacts of climate change, but is also a significant source of emissions and can also be an important part of the solution. To keep 1.5 degree within reach, tackle food crisis risks, and enable the transformation to a global net zero future, halting deforestation, restoring land, and improving agricultural production practices is paramount. Companies in land-intensive sectors have a responsibility and opportunity to make solutions out of these challenges as central on their business models. Whenever there is a challenge, there's also an opportunity. And I would say, and again, I'm biased, but not probably the land and use sector is one in which is the ones that has best opportunities given its nature to actually make opportunity out of this challenge. There's no time to lose. If we are to have a livable future for everyone, we must all play its part in the transformation to a net zero future, and the FLO sector is key for the benefit of us all and for the future generations. So now let's move on a Q&A session where the experts involved in the development of these 3 guidances will be able to answer your questions. We will try our best to get as much as the questions in, given the amount of time that we have. So maybe I can just start with a generic question that I will just ask for everyone to jump in. And it has to do with what is your advice to companies on this journey? What would you suggest that is the things that companies need to do in order to start, the one thing or the one suggestion? And what is the capacity and support that can be provided for those companies? Would somebody, I think
I'll jump in. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Leah.
All right, I'll be brief and then pass it on. So I think obviously there's many things that I can be, and I think will be said by my colleagues. I think as is really relevant to this conversation and this guidance, one thing I'd really say would be for companies to try to really work to integrate all of their various conversations they're having around sustainability within their organizations. So I'm on call sometimes where I talk to a climate person. I'm on call sometimes when I talk to a forest person, getting all those people in the same room, and also in the same room with other departments within the organization, in procurement, in other aspects of the policy, really trying to integrate all of this, because so many of the challenges are the same, whether that's about traceability, whether that's about supplier management. Most of what we're talking about really crosses all of these topics. So I think really trying to think about this as one big holistic problem is probably a big step. As far as support, the AFI is always available. Our coalition members work on any number of these different aspects. So, people can come to us. We can point you in the direction of service providers who can help with specific issues, et cetera. So thanks.
Yeah, I think my guidance would be, as we've pointed out, this is the first time on the accounting side that we're really having to tackle these emissions for the first time. So I would say kind of my first note would be just let's all give each other some grace. We know that this is not going to be perfect out of the gate, and there is going to be a learning curve that we're all going to have to ride together relatively quickly. Sometimes it's like sadly ironic, I guess, that this is one of the last spaces that we're really filling out the accounting guidance, and it is the first that really needs to get to net zero. So we're all going to have to work on this together quickly. And of course, that's why we write the draft guidance. That's why we provide all the FAQ, all of the resources we've provided. And as questions come in, we update these resources constantly to make sure that companies have resources that they can pull on to answer these questions. We also field a lot of inquiries from consultants and directly from companies, to help figure out how to move forward here. But I think we shouldn't, I'm earning my gray hair with this comment, but when the Scope 3 standard was published, everyone was like, there's no way we're going to get the data. There's no way we're ever going to be able to do this. And look where we are today, right? And so that's, I think, how everyone's feeling with remote sensing technologies and otherwise. I think things are drastically going to change even in the next 2 years. So I think let's give ourselves grace and really embrace some of the new technologies that are online to help us move forward.
I think from the greenhouse gas protocol side, I would probably echo a lot of what Martha said. I think, again, with this idea that now we're trying to include all these land sector impacts, I think the first step is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's just to get an understanding of what your footprint is and really understand where your biggest hotspots are within your supply chain. So whether that's using some of the existing databases to give you a general sense before kind of honing in on where you want to do additional work to improve traceability, to target specific mitigation actions. Really getting that full picture is going to be important first. In terms of the types of resources, as I mentioned, greenhouse gas protocol is still in a piloting stage. So we do have some additional resources that we are provided for pilot testing companies, but at the same time, we recognize that other companies setting science-based targets need access to the documents. So we have that publicly available to really understand where a lot of that's at, and that you can begin to start to implement that and to plan, recognizing that there may still be some changes before we publish next year, but there's still a lot of work that can be done in the meantime. And we're also working very closely to identify some of the different tool developers, database providers, and other ecosystem of solution providers within that space. So if you go to our website, we actually put together, compiled a list of different resources that companies can use to try to make the connections. I think there's still some questions about how some of those might relate to the latest version of the guidance that we will be sort of transitioning to tackle after we publish our guidance next year. But the idea is that there are a lot of great groups working in this space to help tackle some of those data challenges, and we're trying to help make the connections of how that relates back to our guidance. So that would be my best answer there.
I don't know if Christopher or Michelle would have anything to say, but if not,
just a very short reflection on that, and I think that comes from the experience now I have with working with IKEA for a while on this topic. I think to invest in digital processing capabilities of data and having kind of this data handling structure in place can be a great support. Now we have this land use change topic, which is one, but then there's also around, for example, ongoing monitoring to be able to report any removals and detect reversals of removals to tackle the permanence challenge. I think there really needs to be a very solid data structure in place for this reporting. So I think to think early about this when companies embark now in this reporting will be quite important.
And maybe a quick addition, I think the core to everything will be traceability and having visibility of stuff. And again, like Matt and others were saying, start somewhere and then you can start refining things is really key. So don't get too hung up with needing to get it to the perfect unit level. Initially, we just start where we can and move forward.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I heard 3 T's. Traceability, transparency, technology, and get ahead of the game, get started. Well, thanks. Just one quick question. There seems to be about more than 50 questions that have been posed so far. We obviously would not have time to answer all of them live, but I do encourage folks to click on the Q&A button because the team is trying to answer them, many of them written as well in the Q&A. So I apologize for that. We're trying to get the most that we can live, but many of the others are being answered in the Q&A. So moving on, I have one specific question for Leah. Cutoff dates. What is the cutoff dates? When is it and why is January 2020 required?
Great, thanks, Louisa. And this is certainly something that we are really hoping to increasingly clarify because it is a really complicated question. So the cutoff date is the date that answers the question, deforestation since when, conversion since when? The vast majority of agriculture was cleared at some point, whether it's relevant to accounting for your deforestation, for your DCF volumes, et cetera, relies on the cutoff date. If it was converted before the cutoff date, then it's not considered to be deforestation in your supply chain. If it was converted after the cutoff date, then it is. So it's really the reference or baseline that's used for determining the impact of products produced or sourced. The AFI recommends that cutoff dates be not later than 2020 for deforestation. It can be any time during 2020. We know that in different commodities and geographies, different dates throughout the year are useful to align with production and harvest cycles, or monitoring frequencies, et cetera. So we're not incredibly specific about dates within that year, but we really recommend that they be no later than 2020. For other ecosystems, we aren't as firm about what the specific cutoff date should be because there's a little less availability of data, there's less maturity of those spaces, but we really recommend that they be as early as possible and in order to actually move the space forward. I think that, hopefully that clarifies it. So just one more little bit is that we talk about cutoff dates and target dates. So the target date, if I recommend, is 2025 for achieving commitments to no deforestation and no conversion. So for example, if you had a cutoff date of 2020, that would then say that, okay, by 2025, we're not going to have any products in our supply chain for which land was cleared after 2020. So that's the baseline date there. Thanks for the question. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Leah. We have another one for you, which is potentially related. How is the uptake of certification by downstream users, such as Rainforest Alliance, or TRS, or SPO, etc., considering the accounting piece for the deforestation part of the discussion? If a company reaches 100% for forest risk commodities, does that count towards the deforestation target?
Great question. So I think Christoph spoke to, certification is one of the most common tools that many companies are using to try to achieve their DCF targets, or deforestation and conversion-free goals. Certification can be used to this end if it sort of meets a couple of criteria, and one is that the principles and criteria of the certification itself includes a no deforestation and no conversion criteria with a cutoff date that's used by the company. So is the certification include that the material is deforestation and conversion free? And second is the company using a chain of custody model that provides traceability and assurance at origin, so a segregated or identity preserved model. If both those things are true, then those volumes can definitely count as deforestation and conversion free in a company's reporting and accounting. The other chain of custody models, such as different mass balance models, can't be used as clearly in this way and might require additional due diligence, additional assurance or monitoring in order to assure that those origins are DCF. This doesn't mean that companies shouldn't be sourcing those other types of certification, the other types of certified volumes. I know that in many cases that's what's available, but that companies should be working with certification bodies, et cetera, to try to improve the traceability and improve the chain of custody models to better meet their needs. One note about the emissions piece of this is that, as was noted, because of the different time horizons, materials that are certified as deforestation and conversion free might still carry land use change emissions that occurred before the cutoff date and within the 20-year time horizon. So that's a little bit more nuanced for the emissions counting piece of it.
Thank you. If anybody also wants to jump in, please feel free. Let's make this a conversation. So one question to Matt. Matt, there are several questions, and I know you already answered some of them on the Q&A, but if you could just potentially present it here live. What are resources and data available to calculate SLOOK? So many questions on resources and data on calculations of land-related emissions.
Yeah, happy to try to take that one live here. Yeah, again, statistical land use change, as I was showing before, can be estimated at a country level. So that's often going to be sort of a known value that database providers can provide lookup tables and emission factors that are publicly available. If you do statistical land use change at a sourcing region level, that would be more specific, and that would require more tools that could account for the different boundaries that might be relevant to your supply chain. So on the first side of statistical land use change emission factors that databases provide, again, Greenhouse Gas Protocol doesn't publish emission factors. We're not a database provider, but we do work closely with databases. We have a process called the Built-on Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which allows for sort of a review of some of those existing methods and tools against our guidance. And through that process, we do encourage companies to publicly disclose their methodologies. Many of the databases do provide that if you ask them for some of their source materials. And I see a number of familiar names in the participants list who can share some of those methodologies that are underlying some of the databases that are out there. But again, I think that going to the database providers to identify what goes into the calculations is going to be important. And again, we're thinking and we're having those conversations to sort of help them align with the latest guidance to ensure that there is consistency across different databases and what to use. I don't know, Martha, I see your hand raised if you want to have anything to add to that.
Oh, I just wanted to build on, there were a few questions about the implementation side of DLUC and SLUC, and if you can only ever calculate SLUC, how would you ever know if deforestation is out of your supply chain? And so just wanted to highlight that, yes, while we have tools and resources and toolkits and guidance on how to address deforestation and assess directly in your supply chain, there are also interventions that happen at scale, like jurisdictional approaches where you're working with governments and many other actors in a region to collectively advance deforestation actions. And because some deforestation is driven, outside of commodity markets, these types of collective approaches can sometimes be more effective in certain geographies. And so I think let's kind of not get stuck. Like it's also okay to act at this broader scale to really get change to happen across an entire landscape. So I just wanted to make sure that was acknowledged.
Very, very quickly, would you look as land use change? Would you somebody clarify the differences between DLUC and SLUC?
Yeah, happy to. So direct land use change, or DLUC, is where companies would have full traceability to individual suppliers within their value chain. Whereas SLUC, or statistical land use change, is where you only have traceability to a country of origin or to a sourcing region. So as Martha was saying, we had a lot of discussions within our technical working group as we were developing the guidance that is the answer always to just engage with individual suppliers, and many times it does take those collective efforts that are at sort of a sourcing landscape scale. So we really wrote the guidance that would be inclusive of kind of achieving deforestation free and land use change, reducing land use change emission targets to be inclusive of both types of mitigation action, so that it's not necessarily have to be only about full traceability or only about collective action.
Thank you. We are getting close to the end of the time that we have here today. I just wanted to leave one last time for final considerations for folks. We have about 5 or 7 minutes just to do that. So if you could just limit to 1 to 2 minutes, but just wanted to see if anybody wanted to give the final considerations, the final message, or the final summary of what had been discussed here for 300 plus people that have attended this meeting.
I guess I would just say, we're really excited to have this guidance, serve this role between the 3 sets of kind of more specific guidance. If there are other resources you see, we get a lot of individual specific company questions, and great, we'll field those over time. But if you all see other resources that would be helpful for us to pull together at this higher level, reach out to Matt, Leah, myself, and let us know what will be useful as you all are embarking on this journey. And again, thanks for all of your support and all of your effort on this work.
I can jump in just to reemphasize really encouraging everyone to be part of this piloting phase with the GHG protocol. I think it's really exciting to be part of still drafting and kind of refining a few points. So it's a great opportunity to do that and to share also what works, what doesn't work, how can we ensure that the guidance and rules are really enabling that enabling environment that I was talking about.
Thanks so much, everyone. I think I would just say that, as has been said by my colleagues, we're really all working on this together collaboratively. We're sort of building the bicycle as we're riding it as this goes. So our real goal, from the AFI and from, I think, everybody else here is really to provide as much information as we can, as much clarity as we can about the best way to understand the impact of agricultural and forestry production on land use change, to pass that information on, to try to get everybody using the same information, reporting on it the same way, to have transparency. The details, as has been noted, the technology is rapidly improving. The best practice is going to improve along with it, and we're all trying to figure this out together. But really, what's going to be, I think, important is that companies tackle this large problem of land use change that, you know, affects everybody who's listening to this as quickly as possible, using the best methods possible, as transparently as possible. And you know, we're all sort of trying to pull together towards that goal. So thanks so much, everyone.
Christoph, any final remarks?
I would just really like to second what Michelle said. No, I think it is really valuable time now for us as companies to embark in this journey and pilot test and try to really find the operational way how to use these guidances. And it was a very long process and quite delayed also in Greenhouse Gas Protocol to come up now with this pilot. I think it really came out quite well, but there are very tricky aspects around permanence, around leakage, this indirect effects. So I think this will only get better the more companies now use this guidance for pilot testing until December.
Maybe I can just to kind of reiterate what a lot of my colleagues have been saying. I mean, it's been great working with everybody throughout this whole development process to really build on just all the great work that has been done in the deforestation space over the last few decades, and then similarly kind of bringing it together with the climate goals as well. So we really hope that this is sort of a powerful new lever that companies can use to really make action within supply chains. And we're hopeful and again want to continue to take that feedback as we go to refine our greenhouse gas protocol guidance to make sure that we're incorporating all that from your own experiences as companies. So look forward to staying engaged with everybody on the call here today.
Well, with that, I think we start to close our event today. I just wanted to end by thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for all the panelists for sharing their expertise and for doing this fantastic work. Thank you to AFI for hosting this event. The new guidance is available within all of those organizations here on the AFI website, on Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and on Science-Based Targets Initiative one. So with that, thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone.